Right. Welcome everyone again. I'm just going to briefly introduce Mark. He's also our chairman. So Mark Wilson-Jones is an architect and architectural historian. And having worked for Mark, I know that he's very fond of the Pantheon. In fact, his interest was triggered when he won the prize of the British School of Rome. And then he became the expert on Roman antiquity ever since. Mark has been trained in Cambridge and at the Polytechnic Central in London. And now he's teaching in Bath, and he's running also a practice in London specialized on classical architecture. Right, that's it. I'm going to hand over to Mark right away, and I'll be back for the questions after the talk.
Right. Okay, so here goes. Thank you very much for everyone and for joining and for your interest. And let me just do the technicalities and get the screen up. So can everyone see a picture of the Pantheon on the left and the title? And I should be small somewhere.
That's working.
Excellent. So off we go. Now, as I just mentioned before we started recording, we could talk for a long time about the Pantheon. And this photograph on the left is by my great friend, Maxime Attayants, who's a wonderful architect and photographer, among other things. And he was just saying that he lectures for 4 hours about the Pantheon. You know, so this is the kind of thing that one could do. And I'm not going to do that. So we're aiming for 50 minutes. I'm not actually going to time myself. So it will just be as it comes. And so then we'll have time for questions later. So I'm going to do a pretty rapid run through and concentrate on issues of architectural design above all. So you'll get some detail about other matters, historical, chronological, and so on, but I'll be concentrating on issues of design. So the first thing, I suppose, is to just emphasize something that's really quite obvious, is the enormous importance of the Pantheon for the subsequent history of architecture. And one could have a long roster of buildings from Hagia Sophia, indeed earlier, and then running through from the Renaissance. And the challenge that the Pantheon set builders is eminently clear from the fact that here in the Duomo in Florence, this great, huge dome that completely dominated the landscape was inspired in many ways by the challenge of the Pantheon and matching its span. And St. Peter's in Rome did the same and went just that big, but no bigger, taller in elevation, it must be admitted. And then there's a long line of buildings that recall the Pantheon, pay homage to it, are inspired by it, copy it in various ways down the centuries. And I'm just putting up here 2 or 3 more. There's the Altus Museum, the Rotunda of the Altus Museum by the great Schinkel. And here we have a building I saw actually just for the first time 3 days ago. So this is Aspen's Library in Stockholm, and Hitler would have built this had he managed. And by the way, I should say that I think the fact that Hitler wanted to do a sort of dome doesn't mean that all domes are cursed. It's rather like, you know, if Trump likes roses, we think roses are no good. I don't think there's too big a correspondence there. And then anyway, we get to architects like Louis Kahn, who are interested in the Pantheon, but do not actually use its form so literally. So there's a more indirect type of inspiration. But Louis Kahn was fascinated by the Pantheon and spent a long time there. Now studying it and looking at it, observing it and meditating on it. Now I'm just going to run through some basics so that anyone who isn't too familiar with the Pantheon has the sort of basic information they need to follow this talk. We are going to just have a kind of fly through the Pantheon, if you like. Looking from above, we see the main ingredients of it, the huge rotunda, the portico, which is facing almost exactly due north, and what is often called the transitional block or intermediate block in between the portico and the rotunda, and the name sort of is indicative of the fact we don't really have, it's not a kind of architectural type, but it is doing this mediation, and it contains the two staircases. And in Italian, it's a sort of more elegant name, Avancorpo. So that's all we need of that. And then we're seeing it from the front. There's that huge inscription, the very dominant pediment, these rows of Egyptian granite column shafts, part of the Corinthian order, 8 in the front, 8 more behind. There's this sort of forestrum, if you like. We go through to the doorway, and then there is this incredible surprise element. The light draws you into the rotunda, and there's this huge space lit from above only. No windows out to the sort of real world, no views of buildings or anything else. So you just have the interior and this contact with the sky, the sun, the cosmos indeed. And you know, this is something of a huge spectacle, and surprise compared to what you might expect when you see a rectangular portico outside. And it's a very difficult thing to photograph, and this is an often used image by Panini. He did several images like this that do a wonderful job of trying to sort of bringing the whole space together. And there we see something that's very important for some of the things we'll be talking about when we get to the interior design in detail. You have these little, well, have the attic, the zone above the main columns, which is cut through by the arch over the doorway, and it has these little pilasters on it. So that's the attic level, which if I go back a second, you'll see that it doesn't exist anymore, except for a little, if you can see my mouse, there's a little restoration of this attic that was put back in the 1930s. Otherwise, this solution dates to 1750, designed by the architect Paolo Pozzi. So proceeding on, we have to remember it's a church, and not only a church. We have no less than two of the few Italian kings who are buried here. So it's a kind of important state monument. So we have an ancient building, a church, which became a church in about 613 AD, Santa Maria Rotonda. And then we have also a official tomb monument. So it's all these things, and of course a tourist attraction. Now then, looking at the forms very quickly, there's the notable oculus, that's 9 meters wide, or 30 feet, 30 Roman feet. You can gauge the idea of the size by the two gentlemen over the other side there. And of course, this is, as mentioned, the only source of light. And the light, depending on the seasons, depending on the time of day, travels down the rotunda, the light pool, and creates these kind of magical, amazing effects that are dynamic and ever-changing, and come at the time of the summer solstice all the way down onto the floor. And that's a wonderful moment, is that the light gets reflected back up. And, you know, so that's just a kind of quick overview. Now, then we have to remember that the Pantheon we're seeing is a later building than the initial first Pantheon. So we've been looking at a building that was created sometime in the early 2nd century AD. And then this was after a cataclysmic fire of one presumes a fire, actually a lightning strike, and then one could debate whether or not there was in fact a fire. But anyway, the first building, the building that was up in 110 AD had to be demolished, and then the new building was the one we see, with the resurrected Pantheon, so to speak, which was the resurrected first Pantheon built by Agrippa. So this is at the time of Augustus, roughly 27 or 25 BC, we assume is the date. Well, from sources. Now then, so this is the name you see there. So you see on the actual building, which was not built by Agrippa, you see his name claiming the patronage of the building. And this is one of many, many puzzles that sort of saturate the Pantheon at all levels. Enigmas and paradoxes, things that you cannot quite expect, sometimes can't explain, or you can hotly debate. And I'm trying to shed some light, or have been over many publications, light about these kinds of things. But this is one of the main ones. So why do we have Agrippa's name on a building that he didn't build, although he built the founding building? So a little bit about this original building. You'll see that if you can see my mouse, here we are at the Pantheon in the middle of what's called the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, the flat marshy area of Rome, surrounded by the Tiber River. And this building was built on the land of Agrippa being if you like, the right-hand man of the proto-emperor Augustus. And it's on axis, importantly, with this building here, the Mausoleum of Augustus. Augustus, naturally, and his family were buried, along with Agrippa, who actually died unexpectedly before Augustus, because he was a younger man. So there's this connection which is very important. Now, the question of what the Pantheon, the original Pantheon, the first Pantheon, looked like was one of those debates that went back and forth over the years. And people used to think for quite a while it was a rectangular building facing the other way. I mean, it's an absolute crazy notion, really, when one looks into it. But in fact, there were excavations in the 1990s that proved that there was a entry staircase underneath the actual, which could be dated roughly to the time of Augustus. And then you find that the foundations, or we knew this actually already before the 90s, that the foundations of Agrippa's building was underneath that of the later Pantheon, the imperial Pantheon. So what really makes sense is that there was some kind of similarly shaped building before the Pantheon, so before the actual Pantheon. So the present building has its footprint over the original. And we can't really predict that much about that building, except the portico is pretty definite. It actually had 10 columns. It was wider than the present building. And there would have been some great rotunda, which is exactly sort of matched by the present rotunda, or rather, it might have very likely had thinner walls, but was sort of subsumed within the current structure. And we presume that it would not have been entirely roofed, simply because two facts. Well, it couldn't be done in concrete because Roman concrete wasn't advanced at the time. And the question of doing a timber roof over that span, concentric, is quite problematic. So this kind of diagram gives you an idea of what could have been there, but it's entirely hypothetical. And this isn't my own work, but I'm just putting in here the reasonably reliable work of other scholars. And so we move on to the actual building, which was built sometime after the previous one burnt down in 110 AD. And by the way, I'm scooting over, this isn't really an archaeological talk, scooting over the possibility that substantial works were done by Domitian in the intermediate period. So here we have the actual Pantheon in plan and section, and just a little bit of terminology to help. So earlier, I think we saw fairly clearly, this is the portico, this is the intermediate or transitional block with the two staircases, and just a little bit more terminology. We have the rotunda with its concrete wall that is 6 meters wide, concrete with brick facing or permanent shuttering. We have 8, or rather, leaving aside, let's say 6 ishedra. We have the entrance and the apse, making a sort of 8-part geometry. And then we have further division into the 16 axes in effect with these edicules here, which would have been associated with statuary. Of course, we don't know enough about where the statuary as a whole would have been. We don't know the whole program. We just have some clues. So we know, for example, that there would have been a statue of Venus there and a statue of Caesar. And Caesar was important as the one on the line of the Julian family, and Augustus was part of that family. So that makes, and then there's the dynastic connection with the mausoleum of Augustus that we saw. So this is all highly important. And then looking at the section and long and elevation, we have the main order. This is the main order up to there. The attic we talked about earlier. Then we have the dome with its coffering. And I think that's really, we won't talk about the grottoni at the back. This is a sort of improvised structure that came about due to building problems, structural problems, and huge cracks. But I'm going to scoot over that because that would delay us. Now, on to the design of the rotunda and the building as a whole. It's famously known to be as tall as it's wide, which is effectively to say the same as you can inscribe a circle in section or sphere within the space. And then the other thing that is notable is that if you imagine that circle passing through the center of the columns of the rotunda, and you inscribe a square in it and flip that square, you get the perfect sort of, well, very nearly perfect coincidence of predicting the column spacing of the portico. And that was one of the first, if you like, discoveries I made back in the 80s. As Victoria mentioned, I started to look at the Pantheon. It wasn't actually the main project I was working on. I was working on Peruzzi. That was the project I went to Rome for the Rome Prize at the British School at Rome to look at the work of Peruzzi. But I got rather fascinated by ancient design. I started to ask questions of how things were done because I wanted to find out what Peruzzi knew about that. And then you start to wonder, well, why were things like that? Well, how did the Romans do their columns and so forth? And there was this tendency to publish overly complicated sort of geometrical exercises with all kinds of crazy lines and intersections, and things were actually somewhat simpler. So here you have a great circle, 150 feet or 100 cubits wide, and that is the geometry that flows out in a fairly self-evident way. Let's not worry about all the details. But you can visualize this with digitally with a cutaway here, you can see. And then in 3D, you have this sort of wonderful intersection of the geometry of the sphere. The cylinder is exactly bisecting that cornice. You inscribe the square we talked about. And if you actually, there's the square, then you flip it, as we said, and then it's actually it's as high as it's wide, which makes, in effect, a cube. So you have the cube relating to the uppermost cornice. So it all sort of knits together very sweetly. You can see how an architect would have great satisfaction, and if you like, a sense of certainty of creating this almost sort of cosmic, geometrically pure building, resolving the problem of how you bring together a rectangular form, a portico, and a circular rotunda with its dome. So highly satisfying. And then you have the complexity. You start with the simplicity and you end up with considerable complexity, a lot to do with the structural challenge. Now, the challenge was set by that dimension of 100 cubits or 150 feet, which may or may not have been the internal diameter of the original Agrippin open to the air Pantheon. But now, because the Pantheon, we presume it's burned down, and anyway, even whatever we know about it, Roman buildings were prone to fire because they had timber roofs. And this building was then made fireproof through a device of concrete. Concrete in the intervening years gained an awful lot in sophistication. And so with all this experience they had over the intervening 150 years, you can now build or try or attempt to build almost hubristically this span, immense span of 150 feet, 100 cubits, or 44 meters in concrete. And then the complexity that you can see in the wall section depends on really trying to resolve this constructionally. It's quite an engineering problem. And the thickness of the wall, it's like a diaphragm structure. It is countering the thrust, the lateral thrust from the dome. And the voids that you can see that goes through different levels of the plan. We have the plan at the bottom, which isn't shown here, but you can maybe reimagine that. And then this is a plan taken part of the way up through the walls and then towards at the top of the rotunda or cylinder. And you still have all these different sets of chambers. And in this cutaway, you can kind of visualize, together with the arches, so-called relieving arches that went over the top of these spaces and carried the load down through the rotunda, you can see that it's almost like a honeycomb structure of considerable complexity to rise to the engineering challenge of a huge fan and all the forces involved. And these diagrams here give you an idea about the concrete. Remember, it's 6 meters or 20 foot thick, and you have concrete with the permanent shuttering of brickwork and the relieving arches of brick and things like the courses of 2 foot square bricks or bipedales, sort of organizing this layer cake of construction. Remember, this is not poured concrete like modern concrete, but it's put in layers and so on. And we start with the actual inert structure, the stone aggregate, starting with basalt at the bottom, very heavy, then moving through stones like travertine and pecorino, all the way up to pumice at the top. So technologically, extremely impressive, sophisticated, and this is an attempt in one single image to sort of encapsulate what is going on. And we have to add to the fireproof theory that the roof here of the portico was supported on a bronze structure, a fireproof bronze structure. It was replaced by a wooden one in 1628, one of the greatest sort of pieces of vandalism to a monument that you can imagine, given it had survived that long. Anyway, so that's a single image that's really sort of, we've got to the end of our basics now, trying to encapsulate the necessary image to then get to some of the questions we're going to puzzle over. Now, the another paradox that we're mentioning or going into is this between praise and criticism. So the building was, of course, greatly praised ever since the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, there was a kind of backhanded praise in the sense that only a devil could have built a structure so amazing. So, but when you get to the Renaissance, you have this praise for the Pantheon. You know, this great building, all the treatises you can think of practically, whether Palladio or Serlio, and so on, have the largest numbers of pages dedicated to monuments are dedicated to the Pantheon. But then there is quite some vocal criticism, both by word of mouth and anecdote, and then written down about the building. Now, first of all, there's the problem of the interior, and we'll do that relatively quickly and move on to the exterior, which will take most of our time, and then come back to the interior again. So here we have an issue that puzzled Renaissance commentators. You have the main order, the attic, and the coffering of the dome, all of which have compositional features and vertical alignments, but they don't match up. In other words, there's no particular alignment between the majority, all of those, the columns you can see on the ground, on the bottom order, and the little pilasters here. And then there's no coordination, or very little, it's not mainly evident between this, and there's a jump in scale between the coffering and ribs of the coffering. So there's a kind of unexpected alignment and misalignment, sorry. Francesco di Giorgio said, when you're superimposing different levels of classical architecture and the orders one above the other, you put like over like. So you put solid over solid and void over void. That is the basic sort of truth and principle of building traditionally. And when Francesco di Giorgio, this is in the late 15th century, drew the Pantheon, he drew it, but also edited it. He created a somewhat different building, a somewhat different interior, and reorganized the pilasters so as to line up with coffering. And that's actually a frequent, become quite a frequent thing. So you look at the treatises by people like Serlio and so on, and you will see that done time and again. And then Sangallo, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, went into quite an essay, in fact, 2 essays, and one of these on this large drawing folio is describing this interior problem, and he also aligns the attic with the coffers. And he says the problem is that 4, 8, 16 geometry that is the sort of guiding organization of the rotunda. And then you have 28 coffers. And this is silly. The architect should have chosen 32, and that would have fitted the logic of 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on, and everything would have lined up in a satisfactory, harmonious, predictable, classical way. We can't go into too much detail here, but you'll just note that he's crossing out here some things he thinks shouldn't exist. There's a whole essay about problems in the portico so that we'll come to. Now, back to the interior, we had a whole load of theorizing that really most of it went with the idea of phasing. In other words, the building wasn't built in a single phase, that there were multiple phases, and this explains the discordance between the different phases, or the apparent discordance. And the Vasari tells us about Michelangelo's criticism that he said the bottom part, the lower part of the building, up to the top of the columns, which actually about here in this image, was built by an angel of an architect. Then a second architect did the attic, and then a third architect would have finished the rest. It's not quite clear whether the third architect would have done the dome and the portico, or quite what he had in mind. But anyway, there were lots of other people doing their variants, and here we have Fontana coming up with his variation, which is to imagine, if you like, a kind of primitive core, a grippin rotunda without the columns, and then the columns, but with the coffered dome, and then the coffers would have been, the columns would have been added, and because of the 4, 6, 8, geometry, 4, 8, 16, you then, had this misalignment. And now then the debate got to be, let's say, everyone became so convinced that the building was flawed, that when they were doing the repair work on the Pantheon in the middle of the 18th century, the attic was completely transformed. We've mentioned it before, by the design by the architect Paolo Pozzi and done in 1750. And you have the whole of the attic stripped out, and this new solution, more neoclassical solution, with these large panels and the same, if you like, windows as before. And here, as we saw earlier, is a view of the restored section on the left there that was put back in the 1930s. So here you see sort of both designs coming up with this problem of not being able to align properly the parts of the building as one might expect. So that's, say, a very severe criticism, is to actually radically transform an ancient, a prized ancient monument. Now, moving on to the exterior, we have a typical sort of solution on the left. Is people were puzzling over the way the portico sat in relation to the rotunda. And Serlio praised the Pantheon to the skies, and didn't say anything negative, but then produced an illustration on elevation that did not match the actual elevation. He eliminated the second pediment that we'll see is there. And Fontana again did the same kind of thing of imagining a primitive building to which he would then add the columns. And that might have been what Michelangelo was thinking about. Now then, let's now have a look at why people had these misgivings, why architects were redesigning, as it were, the Pantheon according to their taste and convictions. So here are a wonderful pair of drawings by Chardin. This is one of the Rome Prize winners of the 19th century. And he did a very in-depth study of the Pantheon lasting years. And there's the front elevation you can see in the side elevation. And this is the problem of the two pediments. So very unusually, you have the main pediment fitting the roof and of the portico, and then an applied pediment sitting above it on facing the transitional block. And then you can see it on the side there. And notably, the main entablature of the portico does not align with this cornice or any other cornice. And as it were, it crashes into the rotunda. And these are aspects that are thought to be either mistaken, wrong, or disastrous, or flawed, or curious, according to one's take on things. And certainly as a young architect looking at a building like that, I just, I'm completely untutored, by the way. I had I think only one lecture on Roman architecture before I came to Rome. And this, you just look at that and you think, well, surely an architect wouldn't really want to end up in this situation. It looks, I suppose, what you might call a term like a sort of bit of a dog's breakfast. It's inept. I mean, you can't really think of any particular sort of positive characteristics of this meeting, of this junction. And so anyway, this is started me thinking. Of course, as I started thinking, I started reading, and then you go to look at the various publications that have gone before, and puzzling with that. We've had just a little snapshot, just a few of them. Anyway, so you have this to add to the puzzle that we now think of. We think, well, people used to think of the building as actually being built by Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, and you have this name. So this could be the name of Agrippa, which could be part of the problem, this phasing. But the information that was coming out from Chardin onwards about the brick stamps in the building, because the Romans sometimes would stamp these their bricks, particularly these 2-foot square so-called bipedales, with stamps, and in some cases they would actually give you a definite year date if they contained the name of the consuls, who by changing every year give you a date in effect. And so the brick stamps were returning, according to the scholars that published them, the names of Trajan and Hadrian, and it was thought to be built by Hadrian. And these stamps are found both in the rotunda and in the transitional block. So the building, or that part of the building, must be built in the time of Trajan or Hadrian, and people thought Hadrian. And then, so you have the name of Agrippa up on the front, which actually in the 1890s, the bronze letters had been restored at great expense. And the minister responsible was absolutely furious at these discoveries of Chardin and thought they were kind of completely wrong, mad, or whatever. And it gave rise to excavations to try and clear up the problem, excavations in the portico that only made matters worse, because as you can hopefully see here, these foundations are continuous. In other words, there's no break between the two very distinct parts of the building in terms of the foundation. So everything hatched here is brick and concrete, and these are the foundation pads for the stone columns. but there's no break in the foundations. That is, these little black dots, by the way, are the sort of shuttering that's in the concrete. This is a concrete trench, in effect, running all the way through there. And so it goes on past right into there. So these two parts of the building must be built at the same time. The portico must be built at the same time as the transitional block. The transitional block has the same stamps in as the rotunda, ergo the whole thing was built in one go, at least at the level of the foundations. And people were thinking about Hadrian. So then what do you do with this problem? Well, people came up, this is archaeologists and commentators in the 20th century, once this information had got thoroughly disseminated and bedded down and debated from the 1890s, people would come up with explanations such as, well, Hadrian was the architect, but he was also an emperor and a poet and did all kinds of other things, and therefore he couldn't have been that good as an architect. Kind of puzzling kind of story, or that, well, a rotunda is a Roman thing, a portico is a Greek thing, and actually marrying them is not so easy, and this is the kind of thing you get up to. Or that, well, the levels in Rome would have been a lot lower than they are now, some 2 meters lower, and people would not have actually noticed this, all of these problems. You'd have been contained by a forum coming up to the front of the Pantheon. It's a lot lower. You would not have noticed. And other people said, well, simply the Romans were just much more flexible than academic types from the Renaissance onwards. They were freer in their compositions and they weren't so sort of fussy and academic. So, they wouldn't have minded, according to this point of view. But, me as a young architect looking at this, you just can't digest that. That doesn't seem possible as an intended design. And then there's other puzzles that when you sort of bed down into it, sorry, getting lots of noise here. I'll try and throw that phone away. You look at the lower part of the junction between the rotunda and the transitional block, and you see that it's quite definitely bonded. There's no break in the construction at this point. And you go up to the top, and the break is absolutely evident. It's sort of hits you in the face. There is no doubt whatsoever that the upper part of the transitional block is just butting up against the rotunda. So you have to kind of square in your mind, what could have happened that would lead to a change in construction. And so this is basically the question. Now, again, I'll just have a little pause here. This is just one of many paradoxes. We've talked about the name being there when it wasn't built by Agrippa, and we haven't even gone into the whole nature of the Pantheon in the sense, is it a temple or is it not a temple, and all kinds of other things. But we're just focusing on design now. What would explain that? Well, even as a young architect, my very first building was in English vernacular, something of a cock-up. Things did not go quite according to plan. And I think, architects know about this. And once you have that triggers the idea, things become, at least you have an idea, you have a possibility that what you're looking at is not what there was actually wanted. You've got to sort of dislocate the two things between intention and realization. So let's think about what this original project might have been that would give rise to the actual project with some compromise. On the right there, we see the actual plan. And on the left, it's joined by the intended plan. Now you look at them, well, it may not seem to be too much of a difference. In fact, there is no difference in the rotunda or intermediate block, hardly at all. But you have the same column grid, but they're bigger columns, they're fatter columns. And what do fatter columns do? Well, with classical proportions, they become taller. And so it's quite simply the actual building there in the original form, you would have just one pediment, rather like Serlio envisaged, except he didn't sort of join it all up and think how it worked. But this is the this hypothetical much simpler building. And from the side, all of that dissonance just disappears. And then in 3D, you find the kind of, you find yourself presented with perhaps a rather neoclassical building, a much more sort of perfect and more obvious building. But it is the obvious thing. That's what an architect would do. And so then, well, what is the exclamation? What was the sort of thinking that led to this? Well, I was doing work on Roman column design, because this is one of the old problems that people seem not to have explained, is the idea of how you design these highly refined columns. And basically, scholars had sort of put to one side methods proposed by Palladio or Alberti or Serlio as not being applicable to the ancient Roman context. And it came down from Claude Perrault's work in the 1680s that effectively Roman column design was empirical and flexible. But flexible about what? And what does empirical mean? It didn't make any sense to me. It seemed to me that there was a method and a system. And I set about measuring the most prominent Roman. There were 10 sets in particular, very well preserved in Rome or nearby, for example, at Tivoli. And we're talking about Corinthian order, and measure them, and you find that of the 10, 3 of them have the same size, which they have 48-foot tall columns. And then another couple are 36-foot tall, and another is 60-foot tall, and another is 24. And if you can't see a pattern there, I mean, it's basic, very basic. There are these multiples of 12 that come through: 24, 36, 48, 60. And then you think, well, the shafts, let's have a look at them. And they, for those same buildings, are multiples of 20, 30, 40, and 50 foot. And then the penny drops. And that's one of the prime principles. Now, then the next thing to think about is that 40-foot shafts, the shafts that go within these 40-foot, 48-foot columns, are relatively common. Now, we're talking about big buildings, big sets of columns, but we're in Rome, and there were quite a few of these. So these three buildings shown here includes the Pantheon. So it too had 40-foot shafts. In this case, like the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina in the middle, made of single pieces of stone. So they're monolithic. And that is another important clue for our argument. And what the theory became that they simply would have wanted 60-foot columns with 50-foot shafts. And I show here the Temple of Mars Alta. That is the kind of acme of Roman Corinthian column construction. There is this rule, the ratio of the 6:5, which was my discovery at the time. And what you're aiming for is this perfect 60-foot, and everything becomes these sweet round numbers. There's a whole system we don't have to go into. It's quite interesting, much more flexible than Renaissance methods, and quite interesting itself. Now, with that in mind, you simply have the idea that you wanted a different project with the same plan, but with taller columns. That's it. And with that idea in mind, all you have to think is that everything you see is the consequence of a compromised project. In other words, it was not intended in origin, and then is the result of having to go through a change of project. So I'm going to show you, I think it's something like 18 different points, which are all little problems, and they all would not have taken place, would not have occurred in the original project. So first of all, in the original project, we would not have had a second pediment. We would not have had the misalignment on the flanks. There are various details like these that we would not have had, for example, 2 different sizes of modillion, the bracket-like elements in the cornice. The pediment would not have been so heavy compared to the size of the columns. And these things are relatively subjective, actually, and scholars have come back at me and said, you know, well, actually, this is just subjective. You can find some other examples somewhere in the empire where similar things happen, and so on. But now many of the other points that follow are not of the same kind, are purely subjective aesthetic judgments. They are more technical. Now, here is one of these technicalities. This is a dog's breakfast of a capital and column. Normally, the center of a capital would line up with the center of a flute. Here, it's miscentered or lining up over a fillet. And there's this sort of mess at the side there, which did not normally happen. And what is more is this width here of this anta is different. You can see here in the diagram the asymmetry involved. And once again, all of this disappears. If you imagine there was the red original project, and then you get the black actual project, and you get the detail here. There would have been a simpler rhythm going all the way to the back. And here you get this more complex situation and this asymmetrical anta. And that's the result. Now, Lothar Hasselberger, who's a friend over in Philadelphia, would argue against this and say, well, look, there's misalignments in the interior, but it's different. This is one pilaster amongst others, 15 or so, whatever number I can't remember, where the alignment is much better, if not perfect. And here, this happens 4 times, and in all cases, equally bad. And you remember that Antonio da Sangaro was having this little essay and said, this stuff should not be there, or it's all, poor work and so on. Well, indeed, this is coming after that. It's quite clear. This is a 45-degree line, but that abacus is going beyond it. This is all added on later and is part of readapting that design to become this. It's not what they wanted in the first place. So good old Sangalo. And then you have this junction on the outside, which is quite horrendous and no one could ever possibly have wanted. And that is the consequence of reducing the size of the column. So you imagine that this column is centered exactly where the original would have been, but it's narrower. Therefore, the entablature that sits over it has to be narrower. And so this face here has to go back towards the building, so to speak. But on the other hand, all of this was already built because you do the main structure of brick and concrete before the columns. The columns will be the last thing to go up because they've got things to be, they're supported against this much bigger superstructure. So that's why you get this jog here. And the architect was trying to invent a modillion facing this way rather to make it look as though it was deliberate, but not very successfully. And then it explains why you have what we've already looked at, the coordination and continuity at the bottom, and then discontinuity at the top, because there's a problem. Something has happened and you're trying to resolve it. So you carry on building the rotunda while you wait to sort out the transitional block and the portico, and that's why you get this strange conditions. And then there's what I mentioned earlier, 40-foot shafts are relatively common and 50-foot shafts are very rare, certainly when you're talking about monoliths. Now, here we are in the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, which I mentioned earlier. And you're looking out into the forum, and remember, these are 40-foot column shafts. Temple of Vespasian has 40-foot column shafts over there. The column of Phocas is a 40-foot column shaft, and there is the Temple of Saturn with 40-foot shafts, once again. Now, then, there's no 50-foot shafts hanging around in the forum, but there is one over at the bottom of Trajan's column, you'll see here. And this is one of the shafts we believe would have been for the Temple of Trajan, which was built at the same time as the Pantheon. And this had 50-foot shafts. Now, you have to remember another key detail that these, not these shafts, these come from Greece, the ones in Antoninus and Faustina. This shaft here, like those of the Pantheon, comes from Egypt. And whereas these weigh 50 tons, which is, you know, an incredible weight, these weigh 100, right? So you are thinking about a project which required 16 columns coming from 2 quarries in Egypt, and each of the shafts weighing 100 tons. So you can imagine there are enormous logistical problems. And in fact, there is a papyrus dated to the winter of 119-120 AD, which alludes to the problems in transporting a single 50-foot shaft, because the one contractor who wrote it is asking another contractor for fodder for his animals that are shifting the thing over at least 50 miles from the quarries of Mons Claudianus, which are near to the Red Sea, and we've got to move them over to the Nile before moving down to Alexandria and the ports there, to then be put on a seagoing vessel to come to Rome. And there is a 50-foot shaft underwater off the port of Alexandria. And presumably, or at least it's one explanation, there would be a whole consignment or two at the bottom of the Mediterranean, somewhere between Alexandria or Rome. Or there's some other explanation for they never assembled enough columns for both the Temple of Trajan and the Pantheon, because in fact those buildings were built not very only a few years apart, if not almost the same period. So and the other another point is that the simplicity of the original design of the Pantheon is not just the columns. The whole design of that front works out with simple dimensions like 50, 60, 75 that complement the original 150 Roman feet of the diagram we talked about earlier. And then there is the wonderful thing that I mentioned, my esteemed friend and colleague Lothar Hasselberger, who's been opposing this theory. But the irony that he worked on a set of Roman drawings that are still visible today on the pavement near the Mausoleum of Augustus, where the stone was docked coming off from the Tiber after it had got across the sea to the ports and then brought up the Tiber. This shows part of this drawing. It's different buildings superimposed one upon the other, but this drawing here relates to the Pantheon. There's the column centers and they match exactly. That's the right inclination, the modillions, the right spacing. But that capital, which of course could belong to another building, but it happens to be the size not of the actual building, but of the intended building. And there's the drawing, there's that drawing superimposed there. So next point, it's a minor one, but still the foundations are unusually wide for columns that size, and they're wide enough to take the bigger columns. And then there are these messy blocks in front that still exist in the face of the intermediate block, visible today, and they would not have been visible. And then there's a sort of setback of this face does not align with that face, as in common with a lot of classical buildings. There's a stepping back as you go up, and this stepping back does not occur at the actual entablature. It occurs at the upper cornice, which would have been the place of transition for the whole design. And you can see here this face is a lot further forward of this face, so this is the upper cornice. And then the last point is this one. It's relatively complicated, so I'll just go over it quickly, but I'll try and get the message across. The present Pantheon, remember that the bronze trusses were taken down and they were replaced by wooden ones more or less in the same format. We have drawings of Borromini that and others that show us the form of these bronze things, because they were made at the time the bronze was taken down to be melted down to make cannon. This is in 1628. And you can see that there's this rather sort of strange propped arrangement. In other words, that this truss there does not actually come to a point where you might expect over the columns. but it comes there to point E. So it's all a little bit weird. And quite simply, you would have had a simple structure in the originals, completely as you would expect it. So there's the two things compared. So that's one sort of relatively recent thing. A friend put me onto this. I hadn't actually realized. This was Louise Rice telling me about this idea back in something like 2012, and then I drew it up. So there we are. Now, I could go on for a very long time, but I'm conscious that we should be getting near the end. So just to say that there's some whole load of other bits of proof in the staircases, which are here. They're one occasion where you can actually study the raw fabric of the building. And by the way, they're not like Palladio drew them. And as Gordon Higgott pointed out, I think Inigo Jones was aware of that problem. So anyway, we're just to give you a glimpse of the results of this survey I conducted in the stairs of the Pantheon, looking at things like the bonding courses, the relieving arches, and so on. And they confirm that the whole structure is of one piece in the lower parts of the building, and confirm that they are not of one piece at the top. Here's a view at the top. You can see that this massive concrete substance, that which had a finished face. This is the rotunda, finished face of the rotunda. Whereas down the bottom, it's all of a piece. This is where someone did a sounding hacking into the building. You can actually get in here. It's about 5 foot tall or so. And this is all continuous work. And indeed, there is a bipedales that goes right across the junction between the rotunda here and the transitional block there. So it's all of a piece at the bottom and disjointed at the top, and various little bits and pieces that we can't go into. And then the final thing has come up, and this is not my work, this is the work of the scholar Lisa Hetland, and recently she showed that the Pantheon was actually begun by Trajan. She looked at all the brick stamps that people had assumed would indicate a Hadrianic date, and she showed that actually the ones we have dated, definitely dated, are Trajanic, with the exception of one. So there's lots of brick stamps that you can date approximately, but only 5 you can date absolutely to 1 year. 4 of them are from the reign of Trajan. 1 is from the reign of Hadrian. And then we have to ask, where is that stamp? Now, the great Rodolfo Lanciani, very important archaeologist and authority, he commented on finding this stamp. We don't know quite where exactly, but we know it was somewhere at the junction between these anta that we've looked at before, these asymmetrical anta, and the brickwork faced concrete here. So it's at the junction of the portico and the intermediate block. And this is where it gives you the date after which, this obviously has to be after, either in 123, late in the year, or the next year, when the portico was put up against the actual the rest of the building. And it sort of tells you that you have a building started sometime after 110. We don't know when. Let's just say after site clearance and design, 113, 114. Who knows? And then there's that letter in 119, the winter of 119, telling us about the problems, which fits the kind of date you would expect for when you would be ordering those columns. And then there's delays while they resolve the compromise design. And then finally, you get after 123, from 1 to 3 or 4 onwards, you get the portico in this form being erected. So everything, it almost is quite suspicious the way things have come together after an initial idea that came to Paul Davis, David Hempsel, and myself in a pub not far from the Warburg Library, I think in 1986. And then quickly published. So now there's one more little bit I'd like to run through, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to do it really quickly and just as a teaser. Because remember all the criticism of the interior, the misalignments we saw, the thoughts of Sangallo. And we go to the corrected, again, the long line of corrected buildings, including Schinkel's Altis Rotunda, where you go in there and everything lines up. But it's not, I mean, I love Schinkel, a fantastic architect, but that's one of his most disappointing structures. It's kind of boring, basically. You go in there, look round, and there's nothing changing. It's all the same. And it's too predictable. But the Pantheon has got this lovely syncopation. So it does have alignments in very key points. And you can see them. So this is void over void over, well, void over void over void, just as Francesco di Giorgio was saying. So I'm very inarticulate today. I can't quite understand why. I'm getting all kinds of jumbled bits of English and wrong phrasing, but like San Francisco here, I don't know what's going on. Anyway, here we have a rib aligned over a window, over a column. So this is a kind of alignment. And then we have no alignment whatsoever. But this is deliberate. We have to sort of shift from analogies, say, to brass band music, very simple music, to sophisticated music, to things like fugues and variations and ideas of syncopation. I wouldn't say it's reggae or jazz, but it's something much more than our usual image of Roman architecture. And the proof of this comes with a floor. Now, if the default Renaissance onwards mode for putting a floor in a circular building is to do a radial floor, just as Schinkel did in the Altis Museum. But the Roman architect who designed this used a checkerboard floor, rather like a chessboard. And there are these different colored marbles. And of course, on axis, everything aligns. So here you get the expected. And then on the diagonal, so I'm sorry, just to confirm there, you get this alignment. And then on the diagonal, you also get an alignment, but it's not so strong. It's like the bishop's move in chess. And then you end up with a rib there. And then everywhere else, you get no alignment whatsoever. And the same is the case of the floor. There is no alignment where the floor meets anywhere else but this axis and the cardinal axes. So it's clear that that's a deliberate intention. And why did the architect do that? Well, because this gives emphasis and it gives dynamics. Because in the exedra, we have, this is the point where the light is pulled in deeper into the wall thickness. And light actually comes in through this grille over this space. So this is punching in and then punching out. And it has a rhythm. And this arrangement brings you back in stronger accents at these key points. And then everywhere else, it's sort of tempting your eye to move on. You become restless. It's a dynamic design. And I think that's partly why people just hang out in the Pantheon. They come and they just sort of, they wander around, they go to different places. They don't all go to the center of the building and sort of admire it from there. They're pulled and pushed and, if you like, enchanted and excited and manipulated even by the designer. So I think that's a rather magnificent achievement. And so I'll end with that. And then perhaps we can have some questions if people are still awake.
Thank you, Mark.
That was an hour, spot on. But usually, I should say, tag talks are usually more like 50 minutes. And then we have more time for questions. But I say, remember what I said about Maxime needing 4 hours. So we tried to get it into 1. So it's over to you, Victoria. I don't know if you want to, if you have a question yourself or you want to field questions from the audience, if there are any.
Yeah, so I would suggest anyone who has a question can either just ask it or raise a hand so we will know and coordinate a bit. But in the meantime, I have a question. So about your compromise hypothesis. you are saying, if I correctly understand you, that the original design was probably planned with higher columns, and then they settled for lower columns. And the higher columns were meant to come from Egypt, and perhaps they sunk on the way. So why do you think they would? What do you think? Why do you think they wanted the Egyptian columns and not the classical Roman 40 feet columns? Is there more?
Oh, do you mean when you say 40? Do you mean why they went for the Egyptian ones and didn't do the design as they?
No, yeah, I understand that they got lost, but why did they originally design it with the Egyptian ones and not with the original, with the more common Roman ones?
Oh no, well, more common sort of marble. Well, the whole thing is that there was great symbolic significance in the use of stone, and the colored stones were enchanting from the point of view, aesthetically, but they were also symbolic. And what they did is they sort of they made visual, if you like, and made evident the Roman achievements of conquering the known world. So many of in fact, the Pantheon is rather unusual in that it has very few Italian marbles. If you look at the Pantheon, you look at the portico, and there's two types of Egyptian granite, and there's pentetic marble from Greece. And then when you go have porphyry also from Egypt, you have serpentino from Greece, you have another Greek green from Thessaly, you have the giallo antico columns from Tunisia, and so it goes on. And so I think when the Romans saw these columns, they weren't just enjoying the contrast between the yellowish stones and the purplish stones and so on, but they actually it told them a symbolic message. And Egypt was particularly important because once they got Egypt, and it's Augustus, don't forget, and Agrippa, who were the key people in terms of defeating Antony and Cleopatra and then taking over Egypt. And the money and the culture that flowed from Egypt was so impressive. And they brought the obelisks back, and these single pieces of stone, the being monolithic meant a lot to them. So one might fantasize that Agrippa's project had granite columns as well, but this is a bit tricky because the quarries aren't supposed to have been opened until time of Claudius. But these are questions. But I think the columns these marbles had such significance that once you decided that was the program for the Pantheon, you weren't going to do another compromise by building the original design, but maybe with the white marble or something.
I see.
So I think that, I don't know if that quite answers.
It does. And it also answers, I think, Matthew Hardy's question in the chat a little bit, who asked, why did they insist on column shafts being in a single piece rather than a series of drums? Right.
I've only partly answered that, but I think if you think of obelisks, that, the magic of these and the whole symbolic value, goes with the fact they were a single piece. And single piece statues, there was a difference, between, it's true that some statues are made, with a head of one type of marble and that, but there was a sense of achievement and wonder going back to the Egyptians themselves with their monolithic statues. And actually the Greeks, there's Greek kuroi that could be up to 10 meters tall out of one piece. And we have inscriptions that celebrate the one-pieceness, the monolithicness of certain statues and blocks of stone. So I think it's a sort of demonstration of sort of symbolic purity, and maybe there's all sorts of religious notions or symbolic notions, cosmic notions, who knows, but there's also a demonstration of power, because only the extremely powerful and wealthy can make huge buildings with huge blocks of such heavy stone. So that 100-ton figure is, the Romans, they wouldn't have, of course, measured things in tons like we do, but they would have known the implication of moving such huge stones. And then, of course, they got, if you like, second best. But that was the spirit of it.
Right. And there was a question by a user called iPad3. You raised your hand earlier. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or?
Yeah, sorry about that. There was a lot of noise in the background, so that's why I changed it. Hello, Mark. It's
Hello
Jane.
there. Hello.
Thank you. That was a lovely. Yes, good to see you too. That was a lovely, lovely and thought-provoking talk. It reminds me of the first time that I studied the Pantheon in Roman art history class, and it was described to me as a living and breathing building. And but the lecturer never went beyond that, and it seems that what you're saying is if we go with what you're saying, that those misalignments were intentional because the alignment is on the diagonal and the central axis, then could that be a reason for that, was to create something that wasn't 100% perfect, but something that not just flexible, but could be seen as a structure that is kind of living and breathing? Did Romans think that way about their buildings?
I don't know if they thought of quite that way, but I think there's they definitely, I mean, all Greeks, they're quite advanced or sophisticated aesthetic appreciation, particularly when it came to sculpture and buildings. And buildings was, we imagine an age before, without smartphones and everything that sort of distracts us. And buildings were a means by which you spoke to people in a sense. And I think also the thing to remember is that they were learning from Hellenistic architecture before it. I mean, classical architecture, as in the Parthenon, is a bit more remote, but the immediate 100 or 200 years before was very significant. And you have all these influences from Alexandria and so on. And there are buildings from that period that do similar kinds of syncopation. I mean, I must admit, they're quite esoteric. You have to go to places like Jordan to find them in standing today, but they do exist. And then there are other buildings from the time of Trajan and Hadrian that also do this kind of thing. And indeed, the Baths of Trajan has similar, which also has semicircular spaces. So it has these what's called exeda, referring to or rotundas. They have rotundas in effect. And they are designed in such a way that there is a similar syncopation in the coffering compared to the axes, even if we do not have the whole wall revetment and the floors and so on. You can see a similar sort of design aesthetic. And there we come across the figure of Apollodorus, who I haven't mentioned because of time, because if we went into the personalities, bang, there would be another hour, which might be entertaining, but some people would drift off and get hungry, but I've actually named my practice Apollodorus Architecture in homage to this great architect who was known to design the Baths of Trajan. And Baths of Trajan has these characteristics. It has, interestingly enough, sort of triangular-like stairs in a not dissimilar way to the Pantheon stairs, and it has a similar palette of marbles. And there's Trajan's forum was also by Apollodorus, so that there's sort of reasons for imagining a kind of fairly personal aesthetic strategy that others would have shared, but is actually different to other approaches that might be elevationally more simple. So I say, it's difficult to get into all of that, but I think we have to get away from, as I said, I used the term sort of brass band music. It wasn't just very simple sort of military kind of architecture produced by pragmatic, sensible Roman people. There was a lot of art and sophistication as well.
So then there's another question by Julia Toda. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. What did you mean exactly by manipulating the visitors, their step trace, their favorite position inside, or their perception and behavior that might be connected?
Right. Now that, well, perhaps I wasn't really clear. I suppose I was thinking more being drawn to certain places. Just say now, if you went into a completely centralized building, you would tend to go to the center, right? Or if you're in a say a church, you're heading for the apse, you know, the altar and the apse, and the architectural signals you get direct you to those places. I think in the Pantheon, what's happening is you've obviously got some sort of concentric aspect, but then all of this what I describe as pushing and pulling, or emphasis and less emphasis, is you're say thinking of music, you know, you're on beat and then you're off beat. This and the fact of these evident misalignment, if we want to call them misalignments, but anyway, juxtapositions or other words like that, means that you sort of it leads you, I think, to move around. I think it's more the movement, I mean, rather it's manipulation is not the right word, but it's encouraging you to move around and experience the space from different points of view, and not just go to the center, and so that is the only place that you can be.
Yeah.
I think
there's more to look at in general. The eye moves around itself as well.
The eye moves around, and I think and people move around. I don't know how to explain it otherwise, because I haven't spent, you know, days and days observing all, you know, different kinds of rotundas, but people do just move around in ways that I don't think is so normal in if you like a neoclassically planned rotunda.
Yeah. Actually, I have one more small question in the meantime. It's very quick to answer, I'm sure. You mentioned Roman feet, and I know they're different to the feet measures we have, but it's interesting for us to know, I think, in order to understand how to measure Roman antiquity buildings. So what is a Roman feet?
Right, the Roman foot is the ancestor of the, you know, imperial Anglo imperial foot, which is approximately 305 millimeters. And the Roman foot was not fixed, you know, with a standard in the same way, but it sort of, obviously they had standards, maybe set up in different cities and so on, but you know, it's roughly between 294 and 297 millimeters by and large, and with some outliers. But if you think of 295, 296, that's about it. So it's a little bit smaller than 30 centimeters.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, these measures go back. The units the Roman used also can be found earlier. So the so-called Greek Attic foot would be the same measure in effect, and they can be related back to the Egyptian cubit. And so it's a sort of these anthropomorphic measures or anthropometric measures which were then standardized, and that's the Roman version.
Right, then we have another question from Gordon Higgott. Fantastic talk, Mark. Many thanks. Does the column diameter play a part in the design, whether in the 40 or the 50 feet column?
Well, and this is a bit of would be a sub-lecture in itself on column design, which we could always do if people wanted. But I suppose what my work on columns, on Roman columns, this is not true of the Renaissance, showed is the height was had significance in its own right, whereas the Renaissance model and the Vitruvian model, from which they took their kind of method, was to set the height in terms of the lower diameter. Mm-hmm. So you decide that your slenderness ratio is 9 or 10 or 8, depending on the order and your interpretation of that order. And 10:1 was quite often used for Corinthian, but some authorities would make composite 10:1 and then say Corinthian 9.5, because there are also Corinthian columns in that region. So there's a spread of slenderness somewhere between 9 and 10, with some outliers. But in some cases, in many cases, you will get, let's say, a round figure for the diameter. And the diameter of the Pantheon columns is 5 feet, the actual ones. And that goes with the 40 height of the shafts to make 8:1. In that case, it's the 8:1 ratio that's key. You then multiply that by 65. And in fact, the theoretical design height for those columns is 9 3/5. So go figure. That's just how the maths works. So the actual columns do have this 5 foot diameter, and it does help. You remember that the overall diagram of that inscribed circle was 150 foot wide, and other measurements like 60 and so on. So 75 foot for the corner for the entablature. 30 foot comes up quite often. That's diameter of the oculus. So the 5 fits within it, but I think it is not a good analogy to think of it in the Renaissance or Vitruvian way as a sort of module that then produces your design. I think it's just the diameter becomes one of many dimensions that work together, like a musical, like harmonic notes within an orchestrated piece of music, or something, in a particular key. So it goes together. The 5. They loved arithmetical relations that made things like 1 to 10, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 4 to 3, 5 to 6, 2 to 3, and so on. And the use of those kinds of dimensions means that you're able to do that. But anyway, it's a bit without getting into a long look at, well, it wouldn't be that long, but Corinthian columns, a bit difficult. But you're doing the height at the same time as the diameter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then we have a question by Anselm Audley, asking, given that the building was conceived under Trajan rather than Hadrian, do you think Apollodorus was the guiding mind behind the original design?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, I would say I was trying to leave the personalities mainly out of it, because it's not something one can prove. But there is let's say there's more of a chance that Apollodorus designed that building than any other Roman architect we can pin down, because Roman architects weren't mentioned very often. Only occasionally were their names inscribed. It was always, the big name was the patron's name, and the architect was at the service of the patron and often unknown. And we have some literary sources, but the longest literary source that is not in the text of Vitruvius, because Vitruvius wrote before Apollodorus, right? So he's writing roughly in the time of Augustus and Agrippa. So he couldn't write about the actual Pantheon clearly. So the longest text about an architect that's not in Vitruvius is about Apollodorus and the row he had with Hadrian. And it goes something like this: that one day Apollodorus was talking to Trajan about some important matters, presumably architectural projects, Trajan's Forum or whatever. And Hadrian interrupted them. And Apollodorus was high-handed enough to say, oh, be off, you don't understand these matters, go and draw your pumpkins, which is thought to be an allusion to the kind of shapes of vaults in Hadrian's villa, which Hadrian was maybe responsible for in some significant way. He maybe, guided his architects to come up with those kinds of solutions. And who knows, he may have sort of created, he probably, we don't know anyway how those sort of umbrella or scooped or scalloped domes, where they came from, but it's possible that he, was a guiding light there, very likely, in fact. And so, anyway, Hadrian was told to go off and draw his pumpkins. So when he came to the throne, he couldn't forgive this insult, But paradoxically, which doesn't really make sense because it's a garbled story that's 100 years later than the event, it's Dio Cassius, who then says that Hadrian sent to Apollodorus a design for the Temple of Venus in Rome, by the way, which also had, like the Temple of Trajan, 60-foot columns with 50-foot shafts, interestingly. And Apollodorus had the temerity to write back that the temple was too squat, and that if the goddesses, that's Venus and Rome, had got up, they would have bumped their head on the ceiling. And so you can either see that that is, and then he could not contain his fury, and he, had Apollodorus put to death. Another story mentions exile. But this is someone defaming Hadrian and putting him in a bad light as a bad-tempered, arrogant individual that had people put to death who didn't disagree with him. So we don't have to believe the whole story, but we can possibly think that there was a conflict about a building design. And sorry, this has to go on. We can't answer this question without a little bit more detail, because this is an old story. In other words, it's a sort of recasting in Roman context of a criticism that was made of Phidias. So back in the days of the 5th century, the sculptor and architectural designer Phidias created both the Parthenon and the Temple of Olympian Zeus with the respective statues. And the great world wonder of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia and the temple that it sat in was criticized because if Zeus had got up, he would have bumped his head on the ceiling. So it's a sort of retelling of that story. And the thing is that Dio Cassius did not think that the Pantheon was built by either Trajan or Hadrian, because he was taken in by the inscription. So even 100 years after the actual Pantheon was built, and presumably people who were well informed might well have known that it was built by Trajan or Hadrian, he thought it was built by Agrippa because he read the name Agrippa on the front. And then the story gets more complicated, but I in my kind of fantasizing, which is all published, by the way, I haven't referred to my publications, that there's 2 final chapters of this book, Principles of Roman Architecture of 2000, and then a whole book on the Pantheon edited with Todd Marder in 2015, and other articles. And basically what I'm saying is that you have this dispute over a building that Apollodorus would have designed for Trajan. Trajan dies early, unexpectedly in 117, coincides more or less with problems of supply of the stone. Remember that letter is of 119 AD. Hadrian comes to power. You have confronted by a long delay in the Campus Martius, in the center of a whole load of building projects that have been completed or coming up to completion. No one knows what to do with the Pantheon. And Apollodorus, I'm sure, would be arguing to wait for the columns. And, 2 more years we'll get them, or whatever it is. And Hadrian's saying, no, get that built. I can't stand this thing. And the big tussle over this building that was either had too tall statues, or the other way of thinking about it, the roof was too low. And so that would be the whole human storyline that goes with it, completely unprovable. And it's tied up with another little paradox, is we have no coins of the Pantheon. It's rather extraordinary, a building of that importance, which many later writers said is one of the most wonderful things in Rome, along with the Forum of Trajan. We have no coins. And Hadrian, one presumes, that had this compromise made, but then didn't want to put his name on the building. And so you go through this homage thing that he was reputed to be humble in the sense of not putting his name on buildings, but the only example is the Pantheon. Otherwise, he named everything. So that's the human background to this. And the final other thing to say is that we know from sources that Apollodorus designed the Forum of Trajan, was this wonderful space, the Baths of Trajan, other buildings, but he also built the bridge over the Danube, which was this amazing thing that had 19 spans as wide as the Pantheon, 19 150-foot spans built with timber, brick and concrete piers, and then timber superstructure. So a most amazing feat. And he wrote a treatise about military engineering, which was effectively the art of producing siege towers and such like. So he was a major engineer as well as an architect. So he was the figure you would turn to for a project like this.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark. I think we have no more questions.
Yeah, that exhausted everyone. I mean,
Oh, yeah. Actually, we have one more question from Matthew Hardy, who asked, what was it that had 150 foot
right,
spans?
it's actually, thank you, Matthew, was the plot thickens, actually. Now, this is the bridge. You know, the Roman Empire was expanding up to the time of Trajan, expanding, and there were the the Dacian Wars that the column of Trajan celebrates. So this is a major, military campaign, and the Romans went beyond the Danube, right? And Trajan had built this amazing bridge in modern Romania, and it allowed the Roman armies to cross the Danube, and with 19 spans of 150 feet or 43, 44 meters. So, there's 19 arches with a timber, with kind of truss. We have to assume girder trusses made out of timber.
And are there archaeological remains?
Yes, there are. Yeah, there's a few remains. And then when I say the plot thickens, Hadrian had it dismantled, had it destroyed, because he didn't want the armies from the other side of the Danube coming over. He wanted the Danube as a border. So Hadrian retrenched the he stopped the expansion of the empire. So I'm afraid that's this human thing coming in again. It's all fantasy, can't prove any of this. But I think it's Apollodorus versus Hadrian. And Trajan dying in 117. So
thank you very much. Matthew says, indeed, the gold mines at Rosia, Montana.
All right, you look right. That's looked at. So I've got friends of mine who, sort of Pantheonophiles, we call ourselves, Pantheon files, and who actually went there a few years ago into Romania and sent me back photos. So and there's archaeological publications, but not enough. And by the way, if anyone really wants to read about Roman bridges and structures like this, there's a fantastic book by Manolis Korez, who's the great daddy of Greek architecture and the restorer of the Parthenon and so on. And he written this book mainly about the roof over the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. And so this is this theatre in Athens, which had an unbelievable span, if he's right, and Manolis is really wrong, rare as in R-A-R-E, you understand, not often wrong, and he's saying that was roofed 55 meters span roof with girder trusses, and he talks about Roman bridges. He talks about the bridge of Apollodorus. So Apollodorus is known as the designer of that bridge. Mm-hmm. So, blimey, yes, I'm getting hungry. How about anyone?
Same. Let's have dinner. Well, thank you very much, Mark. That was excellent. I think everyone enjoyed it judging from the comments.
I do apologize again. I was more garbled than I usually am. Sometimes you can't predict. Sometimes it all comes out fluently, and and other times it's sort of tripping up over myself and not saying what I mean. So I'm sorry about that, but hopefully the message came across. At least the images should speak for themselves, really.
It was really interesting. Well, thank you, and thank you for everyone else also for joining. So I'm going to close this meeting now. And
well, just to say, Victoria, that Craig Hamilton will be doing the next tag talk in May. So that's very, very important classical architect, contemporary, a leading classical architect with great work and highly respected figure, also even by modern architects. Often there's the friction, contemporary architects versus the classicists and so on, which it's tiresome, this kind of perceived opposition. But I think Craig, can appeal to a wide spectrum of, and so do come to that.
Yes. Excellent. Okay, well, then everyone should have a really good evening. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and we hope to see you next time again.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.